I laughed. Somehow his warnings about the sorcerer's explanation, plus the realization of the awesome range of his awareness, had finally begun to take their toll on me. What was the point I was supposed to raise? I asked. If what we witness on the walls is our own reflection, then the thing that's being reflected must be the real thing, he said, smiling. That's a good point, I said in a joking tone. My reason could easily follow that argument. The thing reflected is our view of the world, he said. That view is first a description which is given to us from the moment of our birth until all our attention is caught by it, and the description becomes a view. The teacher's task is to rearrange the view, to prepare the luminous being for the time when the benefactor opens the bubble from the outside. He went into another studied pause and made another remark about my lack of attention, judged by my incapacity to make an appropriate comment, a question. What should have been my question? I asked. Why should the bubble be opened? He replied. He laughed loudly and patted my back when I said, That's a good question. Of course, he exclaimed. It has to be a good question for you. It's one of your own. The bubble is opened in order to allow the luminous being a view of his totality, he went on. Naturally, this business of calling it a bubble is only a way of talking, but in this case, it is an accurate way. The delicate maneuver of leading a luminous being into the totality of himself requires that the teacher work from inside the bubble and the benefactor from outside. The teacher reorders the view of the world. I have called that view the island of Tonal. I've said that everything we are is on that island. The sorcerer's explanation says that the island of the Tonal is made by our perception, which has been trained to focus on certain elements. Each of those elements and all of them together form our view of the world. The job of a teacher, insofar as the apprentice's perception is concerned, consists of reordering all the elements of the island on one half of the bubble. By now you must have realized that cleaning and reordering the island of the Tonal means regrouping all its elements on the side of reason. My task has been to disarrange your ordinary view, not to destroy it, but to force it to rally on the side of reason. You've done that better than anyone I know. He drew an imaginary circle and divided it in two along a vertical diameter. He said that the art of a teacher was to force his disciple to group his view of the world on the right half of the bubble. Why the right half? I asked. That's the side of the Tonal, he said. The teacher always addresses himself to that side, and by presenting his apprentice one half, the warrior's way, he forces him into reasonableness and sobriety and strength of character and body. And by presenting him on the other hand with unthinkable but real situations which the apprentice cannot cope with, he forces him to realize that his reason, although it is a most wonderful affair, can only cover a small area. Once the warrior is confronted with his incapacity to reason everything out, he will go out of his way to bolster and defend his defeated reason, and to that effect he will rally everything he's got around him. The teacher sees to that by hammering him mercilessly until all his view of the world is on one half of the bubble. The other half of the bubble, the one that has been cleared, can then be claimed by something sorcerers call will. We can better explain this by saying that the task of the teacher is to wipe clean one half of the bubble and to reorder everything on the other half. The benefactor's task then is to open the bubble on the side that has been cleaned. Once the seal is broken, the warrior is never the same. He has then the command of his totality. Half of the bubble is the ultimate center of reason, Nana. The other half is the ultimate center of will, Nahual. That is the order that should prevail. Any other arrangement is nonsensical and petty. It goes against our nature. It robs us of our magical heritage. It reduces us to nothing. Don Juan stood up and stretched his arms and back and walked around to loosen up his muscles. It was a bit cold by then. I asked him if we were through. "Why, the show hasn't even started yet," he exclaimed and laughed. "That was only the beginning." He looked at the sky and pointed to the west with a casual movement of his hand. "In about an hour, the Nahual will be here," he said, and smiled. He sat down again. "We have one single issue left," he continued. "Sorcerers call it the secret of the luminous beings. That is the fact that we are perceivers. We men and all the other luminous beings on Earth are perceivers. That is our trouble, the bubble of perception. Our mistake is to believe that the only perception worthy of acknowledgement is what goes through our reason. Sorcerers believe that reason is only one center and that it shouldn't take so much for granted. Genaro and I have taught you about the 8 points that make the totality of our bubble of perception. You know 6 points. Today, Genaro and I will further clean your bubble of perception. And after that, you will know the 2 remaining points." He abruptly changed the topic and asked me to give him a detailed account of my perceptions of the day before, starting from the point where I saw Don Genaro sitting on a rock by the road. He didn't make any comments or interrupt me at all. When I had finished, I added an observation of my own. I had talked to Nestor and Pablito in the morning, and they had given me accounts of their perceptions, which were similar to mine. My point was that he himself had told me that the Nahual was an individual experience which only the observer can witness. The day before, there were 3 observers, and all of us had witnessed more or less the same thing. The differences were expressed only in terms of how each of us felt or reacted to any specific instance of the whole phenomenon. What happened yesterday was a demonstration of the Nahual for you and for Nestor and Pablito. I'm their benefactor. Between Genaro and myself, we cancelled out the center of reason in all 3 of you. Genaro and I had enough power to make you agree on what you were witnessing. Several years ago, you and I were with a bunch of apprentices one night, but I didn't have enough power by myself alone to make all of you witness the same thing. He said that, judging by what I had told him, I had perceived the day before, and from what he had seen about me, his conclusion was that I was ready for the sorcerer's explanation. He added that so was Pablito, but he was uncertain about Nestor. To be ready for the sorcerer's explanation is a very difficult accomplishment, he said. It shouldn't be, but we insist on indulging in our lifelong view of the world. In this respect, you and Nestor and Pablito are alike. Nestor hides behind his shyness and gloom, Pablito behind his disarming charm. You hide behind your cockiness and words. All are views that seemed to be unchallengeable, and as long as you 3 persist in using them, your bubbles of perception have not been cleared, and the sorcerer's explanation will have no meaning. In a spirit of jest, I said that I had been obsessed with the famous sorcerer's explanation for a very long time, but the closer I got to it, the further it seemed to be. I was going to add a joking comment when he took the words right out of my mouth. "Wouldn't it be something if the sorcerer's explanation turns out to be a dud?" he asked in the midst of loud laughter. He patted me on the back and seemed to be delighted, like a child anticipating a pleasant event. "Genaro is a stickler for the rule," he said in a confiding tone. "There's nothing to this confounded explanation. If it would have been up to me, I would have given it to you years ago. Don't put put too much stock in it.
He looked up and examined the sky.
Now you are ready,
he said in a dramatic and solemn tone.
It's time to go. But before we leave this place, I have to tell you one last thing. The mystery, or the secret of the sorcerer's explanation, is that it deals with unfolding the wings of perception.
He put his hand over my writing pad and said that I should go to the bushes and take care of my bodily functions, and after that I should take off my clothes and leave them in a bundle right where we were. I looked at him questioningly, and he explained that I had to be naked, but that I could keep my shoes and my hat on. I insisted on knowing why I had to be naked. Don Juan laughed and said that the reason was rather personal and had to do with my own comfort, and that I myself had told him that that was the way I wanted it. His explanation baffled me. I felt that he was playing a joke on me, or that in conformity with what he had revealed to me, he was simply displacing my attention. I wanted to know why he was doing that. He began to talk about an incident that had happened to me years before while we had been in the mountains of northern Mexico with Don Genaro. On that occasion, they were explaining to me that reason could not possibly account for everything that took place in the world. In order to give me an undeniable demonstration of it, Don Genaro performed a magnificent leap as a nagual and elongated himself to reach the top of some peaks 10 or 15 miles away. Don Juan said that I missed the issue, and that as far as convincing my reason was concerned, Don Genaro's demonstration was a failure, but from the point of view of my bodily reaction, it was a riot. The bodily reaction that Don Juan was referring to was something which was very vivid in my mind. I saw Don Genaro disappear in front of my very eyes as if a wind had swished him away. His leap, or whatever he had done, had had such a profound effect on me that I felt as if his movement had ripped something in my intestines. My bowels became loose, and I had to throw away my pants and shirt. My discomfort and embarrassment knew no limits. I had to walk naked, wearing only a hat, on a heavily trafficked highway until I got to my car. Don Juan reminded me that it was then that I'd told him not to let me ruin my clothes again. After I'd taken my clothes off, we walked a few hundred feet to a very large rock overlooking the same ravine. He made me look down. There was a drop of over 100 feet. He then told me to turn off my internal dialogue and listen to the sounds around us. After a few moments, I heard the sound of a pebble bouncing from rock to rock on its way down to the bottom of the ravine. I heard every single bounce of the pebble with inconceivable clarity. Then, I heard another pebble being thrown, and another one yet. I lifted my head to align my left ear to the direction of the sound and saw Don Genaro sitting on top of the rock 12 or 15 feet from where we were. He was casually tossing pebbles down into the ravine. He yelled and cackled when I saw him, and he said that he'd been hiding there waiting for me to discover him. I had a moment of bafflement. Don Juan whispered in my ear repeatedly that my reason was not invited to that event, and that I should give up the nagging desire to control everything. He said that the Nagual was a perception only for me, and that was the reason Pablito had not seen the Nagual in my car. He added, as if reading my unvoiced feelings, that although the Nagual was for me alone to witness, it still was Don Genaro himself. Don Juan took me by the arm and, in a playful manner, led me to where Don Genaro was sitting. Don Genaro stood up and came closer to me. His body radiated a heat that I could see, a glow which dazzled me. He came to my side, and without touching me, he put his mouth close to my left ear and began to whisper. Don Juan also began whispering in my other ear. Their voices were synchronized. They were both repeating the same statements. They said, that I should not be afraid, and that I had long, powerful fibers, which were not there to protect me, for there was nothing to protect or to be protected from, but that they were there to guide my Nagual's perception in very much the same way my eyes guided my normal Tonal's perception. They told me that my fibers were all around me, that through them I could perceive everything at once, and that one single fiber was enough for a leap from the rock into the ravine, or up from the ravine to the rock. I had listened to everything they had whispered. Every word seemed to have had a unique connotation for me. I could retain every utterance and then play it back as if I were a tape recorder. They both urged me to leap to the bottom of the ravine. They said that I should first feel my fibers, then isolate one that went all the way down to the bottom of the ravine and follow it. As they spoke their commands, I actually could match their words with adequate feelings. I sensed an itching all over me, especially a most peculiar sensation which was indiscernible in itself but approximated the sensation of a long itching. My body could actually feel the bottom of the ravine, and I sensed that feeling as an itching in some undefined area of my body. Don Juan and Don Genaro kept on coaxing me to slide through that feeling, but I didn't know how. I then heard Don Genaro's voice alone. He said that he was going to jump with me. He grabbed me, or pushed me, or embraced me, and plunged with me into the abyss. I had the ultimate sensation of physical anguish. It was as if my stomach was being chewed and devoured. It was a mixture of pain and pleasure of such intensity and duration that all I could do was to yell and yell at the top of my lungs. When the sensation subsided, I saw an inextricable cluster of sparks and dark masses, beams of light and cloud-like formations. I couldn't tell whether my eyes were open or closed, or where my eyes were, or where my body was, for that matter. Then I sensed the same physical anguish, although not as pronounced as the first time, and next I had the impression I had woken up, and I found myself standing on the rock with Don Juan and Don Genaro. Don Juan said that I had goofed again, that it was useless to leap if the perception of the leap was going to be chaotic. Both of them repeated countless times in my ears that the Nagual by itself was of no use, that it had to be tempered by the Tonal. They said that I had to leap willingly and be aware of my act. I hesitated, not so much because I was afraid, but because I was reluctant. I felt my vacillation, as if my body were swinging from side to side like a pendulum. Then some strange mood overtook me, and I leaped with all my corporealness. I wanted to think as I took the plunge, but I couldn't. I saw, as if through a fog, the walls of the narrow gorge and the jutting rocks at the bottom of the ravine. I didn't have a sequential perception of my descent. I had instead the sensation that I was actually on the ground at the bottom. I distinguished every feature of the rocks in a short circle around me. I noticed that my view wasn't unidirectional and stereoscopic from the level of the eyes, but flat and all around me. After a moment, I panicked, and something pulled me up like a yo-yo. Don Juan and Don Genaro made me perform the leap over and over. After every jump, Don Juan urged me to be less reticent and unwilling. He said time and time again that the sorcerer's secret in using the Nagual was in our perception, that leaping was simply an exercise in perception, and that it would end only after I had succeeded in perceiving, as a perfect Tonal, what was at the bottom of the ravine. At one moment, I had an inconceivable sensation. I was fully and soberly aware that I was standing on the edge of the rock with Don Juan and Don Genaro whispering in my ears, and then in the next instant I was looking at the bottom of the ravine. Everything was perfectly normal. It was almost dark by then, but there was still enough light to make everything absolutely recognizable as in the world of my everyday life. I was watching some bushes when I heard a sudden noise, a rock rolling down. I saw instantly a good-sized rock tumbling down the wall of the ravine towards me. In a flash, I also saw Don Genaro throwing it. I had an attack of panic, and an instant later I had been pulled back to the site on top of the rock. I looked around. Don Genaro wasn't there anymore. Don Juan began to laugh and said that Don Genaro had left because he couldn't stand my stench. I then had the embarrassing realization that I was truly a mess. Don Juan had been right in making me take my clothes off. He walked me to a stream nearby and washed me like a horse, scooping water with my hat and throwing it at me, while he made hilarious comments about having saved my pants. The bubble of perception. I spent the day by myself at Don Genaro's house. I slept most of the time. Don Juan came back in the late afternoon and we hiked in complete silence to a nearby range of mountains. We stopped at dusk and sat on the edge of a deep gorge until it was almost dark. Then Don Juan led me to another place close by, a monumental cliff with a sheer vertical rock wall. The cliff was unnoticeable from the trail that led to it. Don Juan, however, had shown it to me several times before. He had made me look over the edge and had told me that the whole cliff was a place of power, especially the base of it, which was a canyon several hundred feet down. Every time I had looked into it, I had had a discomforting chill. The canyon was always dark and menacing. Before we reached the place, Don Juan said that I had to go on by myself and meet Pablito on the edge of the cliff. He recommended that I should relax and perform the gate of power in order to wash away my nervous tiredness. Don Juan stepped aside to the left of the trail, and the darkness simply swallowed him. I wanted to stop and examine where he'd gone, but my body didn't obey. I began to jog, although I was so tired that I could hardly keep on my feet. When I reached the cliff, I couldn't see anyone there, and I went on jogging in place, breathing deeply. After a while, I relaxed a bit. I stood motionless with my back against a rock, and I noticed then the shape of a man a few feet away from me. He was sitting, hiding his head in his arms. I had a moment of intense fright and recoiled, but then I explained to myself that the man must be Pablito, and without any hesitation, I advanced towards him. I called Pablito's name out loud. I figured that he must have been uncertain of who I was and had become so scared that he had covered his head not to look. But before I reached him, some inexplicable fear took possession of me. My body froze on the spot with my right arm already extended to touch him. The man lifted his head up. It was not Pablito. His eyes were two enormous mirrors, like a tiger's eyes.
We are one.
My body jumped backwards.
Unified.
My muscles tensed, and then released the tension without the slightest influence of my volition, and I performed a backward leap, so fast and so far that under normal conditions I would have plunged into a grandiose speculation about it.
And we move
As it was, however,
as
my fright was so out of proportion that I had no inclination for pondering, and I would have run out of there had it not been that someone held my arm forcibly. The feeling that someone was holding me by the arm threw me into total panic. I screamed. My outburst, instead of being the shriek I thought it should have been, was a long, chilling yell. I turned to face my assailant. It was Pablito, who was shaking even more than me. My nervousness was at its peak. I couldn't talk. My teeth chattered, and ripples went through my back, making me jerk involuntarily. I had to breathe through my mouth. Pablito said between chatters that the Nagual had been waiting for him, that he had barely gotten out of its clutches when he bumped into me, and that I had nearly killed him with my yell. I wanted to laugh and made the most weird sounds imaginable. When I regained my calmness, I told Pablito that apparently the same thing had happened to me. The end result in my case had been that my fatigue had vanished. I felt instead an uncontainable surge of strength and well-being. Pablito seemed to be experiencing the same sensations. We began to giggle in a nervous, silly way. I heard the sound of soft and careful steps in the distance. I detected the sound before Pablito. He appeared to react to my stiffening. I had the certainty that someone was approaching the place where we were. We turned in the direction of the sound. A moment later, the silhouettes of Don Juan and Don Genaro became visible. They were walking calmly and stopped 4 or 5 feet away from us. Don Juan was facing me and Don Genaro faced Pablito. I wanted to tell Don Juan that something had scared me nearly out of my wits, but Pablito squeezed my arm. I knew what he meant. There was something strange about Don Juan and Don Genaro. As I looked at them, my eyes began to get out of focus. Don Genaro gave a sharp command. I didn't understand what he had said, but I knew he had meant that we should not cross our eyes.
The darkness has settled on the world,
Don Juan said, looking at the sky. Don Genaro drew a half moon on the hard ground. For a moment, it seemed to me that he had used some iridescent chalk, but then I realized that he wasn't holding anything in his hand. I was perceiving the imaginary half moon that he had drawn with his finger. He made Pablito and me sit on the inner curve of the convex edge, while he and Don Juan sat cross-legged on the extreme ends of the half moon, 6 or 7 feet away from us. Don Juan spoke first. He said that they were going to show us their allies. He told us that if we would gaze at their left side, between their hips and their rib bones, we would see something like a rag or a handkerchief hanging from their belts. Don Genaro added that next to the rags on their belts, there were 2 round button-like things, and that we should gaze at their belts until we saw the rags and the buttons. Before Don Genaro had spoken, I had already noticed some flat item, like a piece of cloth, and 1 round pebble that hung from their belts. Don Juan's allies were darker and more menacing than Don Genaro's. My reaction was a mixture of curiosity and fear. My reactions were experienced in my stomach, and I wasn't judging anything in a rational manner. Don Juan and Don Genaro reached for their belts and seemed to unhook the dark pieces of cloth. They took them with their left hands. Don Juan flung his in the air above his head, but Don Genaro let his drop to the ground, gently. The pieces of cloth stretched as if the hurling and the dropping had made them spread like perfectly smooth handkerchiefs. They descended slowly, bobbing like kites. The movement of Don Juan's ally was the exact replica of what I had perceived him doing when he had whirled around days before. As the pieces of cloth got closer to the ground, they became solid, round, and massive. They first curled, as though they had fallen over a doorknob. Then they expanded. Don Juan's grew into a voluminous shadow. It took the lead and moved towards us, crushing small rocks and hard lumps of dirt. It came within 4 or 5 feet of us, to the very dip of the half moon between Don Juan and Don Genaro. At one moment, I thought it was going to roll over us and pulverize us. My terror at that instant was like a burning fire. The shadow in front of me was gigantic, perhaps 14 feet high and 6 feet across. It moved as if it were feeling its way around with no eyes. It jerked and wobbled. I knew that it was looking for me. Pablito, at that moment, hid his head against my chest. The sensation that his movement produced in me dispelled some of the awesome attention that I had focused on the shadow. The shadow seemed to become disassociated, judging by its erratic jerks, and then it moved out of sight, merging with the darkness around. I shook Pablito. He lifted his head and let out a muffled scream. I looked up. A strange man was staring at me. He seemed to have been right behind the shadow, perhaps hiding behind it. He was rather tall and lanky. He had a long face, no hair, and the left side of his head was covered by a rash or an eczema of some sort. His eyes were wild and shiny. His mouth was half open. He wore some strange pajama-like clothing. His pants were too short for him. I couldn't distinguish whether or not he had shoes on. He stood looking at us for what seemed to be a long time, as if waiting for an opening in order to lurch at us and tear us apart. There was so much intensity in his eyes. It wasn't hatred or violence, but some sort of animal feeling of distrust. I couldn't stand the tension any longer. I wanted to adapt a fighting position that Don Juan had taught me years before, and I would have done so had it not been for Pablito, who whispered that the ally could not go over the line that Don Genaro had drawn on the ground. I realized then that there was indeed a bright line that seemed to detain whatever was in front of us. After a moment, the man moved away to the left, just like the shadow before. I had the sensation that Don Juan and Don Genaro had called them both back. There was a short, quiet pause. I couldn't see Don Juan or Don Genaro anymore. They were no longer sitting on the points of the half moon. Suddenly, I heard the sound of two small pebbles hitting the solid rock floor where we were sitting. And in a flash, the area in front of us lit up as if a mellow yellowish light had been turned on. In front of us, there was a ravenous beast, a giant, nauseating-looking coyote or wolf. Its whole body was covered with a white secretion like perspiration or saliva. Its hair was raggedy and wet. Its eyes were wild. It growled with a blind fury that sent chills through me. Its jaw shivered and globs of saliva flew all over the place. It pawed the ground like a mad dog trying to get loose from a chain. Then it stood on its hind legs and moved its front paws and its jaws rapidly. All its fury seemed to be concentrated on breaking some barrier in front of us. I became aware that my fear of that crazed animal was of a different sort than the fear of the two apparitions I had witnessed before. My dread of that beast was a physical revulsion and horror. I looked on in utter impotence at its rage. Suddenly, it seemed to lose its wildness and trotted out of sight. I then heard something else coming towards us, or perhaps I sensed it. All of a sudden, the shape of a colossal feline loomed in front of us. I first saw its eyes in the darkness. They were huge and fixed like two pools of water reflecting light. It snorted and growled softly. It exhaled air and moved back and forth in front of us without taking its eyes away from us. It did not have the electric glow that the coyote had. I couldn't distinguish its features clearly, and yet its presence was infinitely more ominous than the other beasts. It seemed to be gathering strength. I felt that it was so daring that it would go beyond its limits. Pablito must have had a similar feeling, for he whispered that I should duck my head and lie almost flat against the ground. A second later, the feline charged. It ran towards us, and then leaped with its paws extended forward. I closed my eyes and hid my head and my arms against the ground. I felt that the beast had ripped the protective line that Don Genaro had drawn around us and was actually on top of us. I felt its weight pinning me down, the fur on its belly rubbed against my neck. It seemed that its forelegs were caught in something. It wriggled to set itself free. I felt its jerking and prodding and heard its diabolic puffing and hissing. I knew then that I was lost. I had a vague sense of a rational choice, and I wanted to resign myself calmly to my fate of dying there, but I was afraid of the physical pain of dying under such awful circumstances. Then, some strange force surged from my body. It was as if my body refused to die and pooled all its strength in one single point, my left arm and head. I felt an indomitable surge coming through it. Something uncontrollable was taking possession of my body, something that forced me to push the massive, malignant weight of that beast off of us. Pablito seemed to have reacted in the same fashion, and we both stood up at once. There was so much energy created by both of us that the beast was flung like a rag doll. The exertion had been supreme. I collapsed on the ground, panting for air. The muscles of my stomach were so tense that I couldn't breathe. I didn't pay any attention to what Pablito was doing. I finally noticed that Don Juan and Don Genaro were helping me to sit up. I saw Pablito spread on the ground, face down with his arms outstretched. He seemed to have fainted. After they had made me sit up, Don Juan and Don Genaro helped Pablito. Both of them rubbed his stomach and back. They made him stand up again, and after a while, he could sit up by himself again. Don Juan and Don Genaro sat on the ends of the half moon, and then they began to move in front of us, as if a rail existed between the 2 points, a rail that they were using to shift their positions back and forth from one side to the other. Their movements made me dizzy. They finally stopped next to Pablito and began to whisper in his ear. After a moment, they stood up, all three of them at once, and walked to the edge of the cliff. Don Genaro lifted Pablito as if he were a child. Pablito's body was stiff like a board. Don Juan held Pablito by the ankles. He whirled him around, seemingly to gain momentum and force, and finally he let go of his legs and hurled his body out over the abyss, away from the edge of the cliff. I saw Pablito's body against the dark western sky. It described circles, just like Don Juan's body had done days before. The circles were slow. Pablito seemed to be gaining altitude instead of falling down. Then the circling became accelerated. Pablito's body twirled like a disc for a moment, and then it disintegrated. I perceived that it had vanished in thin air. Don Juan and Don Genaro came to my side, squatted by me, and proceeded to whisper in my ears. Each said something different, yet I had no trouble in following their commands. It was as if I became split the instant they uttered their first words. I felt that they were doing with me what they had done with Pablito. Don Genaro made me whirl, and then I had the thoroughly conscious sensation of spinning or floating for a moment. Next, I was rushing through the air, plummeting down to the ground at a tremendous speed. I felt, as I was falling, that my clothes were ripping off, then my flesh fell off, and finally, only my head remained. I had the very clear sensation that as my body became dismembered, I lost my superfluous weight, and thus my falling lost its momentum, and my speed decreased. My descent was no longer a vertigo. I began to move back and forth like a leaf. Then my head was stripped of its weight, and all that was left of me was a square centimeter, a nugget, a tiny pebble-like residue. All my feeling was concentrated there. Then the nugget seemed to burst, and I was 1,000 pieces. I knew, or something somewhere knew, that I was aware of the 1,000 pieces at once. I was the awareness itself. Then, some part of that awareness began to be stirred. It rose, grew, it became localized, and little by little I regained the sense of boundaries, consciousness, or whatever, and suddenly the me I knew and was familiar with erupted into the most spectacular view of all the imaginable combinations of beautiful scenes. It was as if I were looking at thousands of pictures of the world, of people, of things. The scenes then became blurry. I had the sensation that they were being passed in front of my eyes at a greater speed until I couldn't single out any of them for examination. Finally, it was as if I were witnessing the organization of the world rolling past my eyes in an unbroken, endless chain. I suddenly found myself standing on the cliff with Don Juan and Don Genaro. They whispered that they had pulled me back and that I had witnessed the unknown that no one can talk about. They said that they were going to hurl me into it once more and that I should let the wings of my perception unfold and touch the tonal and the nagual at once without being aware of going back and forth from one to the other. I again had the sensations of being tossed, spinning and falling down at a tremendous speed. Then I exploded. I disintegrated. Something in me gave out. It released something I had kept locked up all my life. I was thoroughly aware then that my secret reservoir had been tapped and that it poured out unrestrainedly. There was no longer the sweet unity I call me. There was nothing, and yet that nothing was filled. It wasn't light or darkness, hot or cold, pleasant or unpleasant. It wasn't that I moved or floated or was stationary. Neither was I a single unit, a self as I am accustomed to being. I was a myriad of selves, which were all me, a colony of separate units that had a special allegiance to one another and would join unavoidably to form one single awareness, my human awareness. It wasn't that I knew beyond the shadow of a doubt, because there was nothing I could have known with. But all my single awarenesses knew that the I, the me of my familiar world, was a colony, a conglomerate of separate and independent feelings that had an unbending solidarity to one another. The unbending solidarity of my countless awarenesses, the allegiance that those parts had for another, was my life force. A way of describing that unified sensation would be to say that those nuggets of awareness were scattered. Each one of them was aware of itself, and none was more predominant than the other. Then something would stir them, and they would join and emerge onto an area where all of them had to be pooled in one clump, the me I know. As me, myself, then I would witness a coherent scene of worldly activity, or a scene that pertained to other worlds, and which I thought must have been pure imagination, or a scene that pertained to pure thinking, that is. I had views of intellectual systems, or of ideas strung together as verbalizations. In some scenes, I talked to myself to my heart's content. After every one of those coherent views, the me would disintegrate and be nothing once more. During one of those excursions into a coherent view, I found myself on the cliff with Don Juan. I instantly realized that I was then the total me I am familiar with. I felt my physicality as real. I was in the world rather than merely viewing it. Don Juan hugged me like a child. He looked at me. His face was very close. I could see his eyes in the darkness. They were kind. They seemed to hold a question. I knew what it was. The unspeakable was truly unspeakable. "Well," he asked softly, as if he would need my reaffirmation. I was speechless. The words numb, bewildered, confused, and so on were not in any way appropriate descriptions of my feelings at that moment. I was not solid. I knew that Don Juan had to grab me and keep me forcibly on the ground, otherwise I would have floated in the air and disappeared. I wasn't afraid of vanishing. I longed for the unknown where my awareness was not unified. Don Juan walked me slowly, pushing down on both of my shoulders to an area around Don Genado's house. He made me lie down and then covered me with soft dirt from a pile that he seemed to have prepared beforehand. He covered me up to my neck. With leaves, he made a sort of pillow for my head to rest on and told me not to move or fall asleep at all. He said that he was going to sit and keep me company until the earth had again consolidated my form. I felt very comfortable and had a nearly invincible desire to fall asleep, but Don Juan wouldn't let me. He demanded that I should talk about anything under the sun except what I had just experienced. I didn't know what to talk about at first. Then I asked about Don Genaro. Don Juan said that Don Genaro had taken Pablito and had buried him somewhere around there, and was doing with him what he himself was doing with me. I had the desire to sustain the conversation, but something in me was incomplete. I had an unusual indifference, a tiredness that was more like boredom. Don Juan seemed to know how I felt. He began to talk about Pablito and how our fates were interlocked. He said that he became Pablito's benefactor at the same time that Don Genaro became his teacher. And the power had paired Pablito and me step by step. He made the emphatic remark that the only difference between Pablito and me was that while Pablito's world as a warrior was governed by coercion and fear, mine was governed by affection and freedom. Don Juan explained that such a difference was due to the intrinsically different personalities of the benefactors. Don Genaro was sweet and affectionate and funny, while he himself was dry, authoritarian, and direct. He said that my personality demanded a strong teacher but a tender benefactor, and that Pablito was the opposite. He needed a kind teacher and a stern benefactor. We talked for a while longer, and then it was morning. When the sun appeared over the mountains on the eastern horizon, he helped me to get up from under the dirt. After I woke up in the early afternoon, Don Juan and I sat by the door of Don Genaro's house. Don Juan said that Don Genaro was still with Pablito, preparing him for the last encounter.
Tomorrow you and Pablito will go into the unknown, he said. I must prepare you for it now. You will go into it by yourselves. Last night, you two were like yo-yos being pulled back and forth. Tomorrow, you will be on your own. I had then a rush of curiosity, and questions about my experiences of the night before just poured out of me. He was unruffled by my barrage. Today, I have to accomplish a most crucial maneuver, he said. I have to trick you for the last time, and you must fall for my tricking.
He laughed and slapped his thighs.
What Genaro wanted to show you with the first exercise the other night was how sorcerers use the Nahual, he went on. There's no way to get to the sorcerer's explanation unless one has willingly used the Nahual, or rather, unless one has willingly used the Tonal to make sense out of one's actions in the Nahual. Another way of making all this clear is to say that the view of the Tonal must prevail if one is going to use the Nahual the way sorcerers do.
I told him that I had found a blatant incongruity in what he had just said. On the one hand, he'd given me 2 days before an incredible recapitulation of his studied acts over a period of years. Acts designed to affect my view of the world. And on the other hand, He wanted that same view to prevail.
One thing has nothing to do with the other, he said. Order in our perception is the exclusive realm of the tonal. Only there can our actions have a sequence. Only there are they like stairways where one can count the steps. There is nothing of that sort in the Nahual. Therefore, the view of the tonal is a tool, and as such, it is not only the best tool, but the only one we've got. Last night, your bubble of perception opened, and its wings unfolded. There is nothing else to say about it. It is impossible to explain what happened to you, so I'm not going to attempt to, and you shouldn't try to either. It should be enough to say that the wings of your perception were made to touch your totality. Last night, you went back and forth from the Nahual to the tonal, time and time again. You were hurled in twice so as to leave no possibility for mistakes. The second time, you experienced the full impact of the journey into the unknown, and your perception unfolded its wings when something in you realized your true nature. You are a cluster. This is the sorcerer's explanation. The Nahual is the unspeakable. All the possible feelings and beings and selves float in it like barges, peaceful, unaltered, forever. Then the glue of life binds some of them together. You yourself found that out last night, and so did Pablito, and so did Genaro the time he journeyed into the unknown, and so did I. When the glue of life binds those feelings together, a being is created. A being that loses the sense of its true nature and becomes blinded by the glare and clamor of the area where beings hover, the tonal. The tonal is where all the unified organization exists. A being pops into the tonal once the force of life has bound all the needed feelings together. I said to you once that the tonal begins at birth and ends at death. I said that because I know that as soon as the force of life leaves the body, all those single awarenesses disintegrate and go back again to where they came from, the Nahual. What a warrior does in journeying into the unknown is very much like dying, except that his cluster of single feelings do not disintegrate, but expand a bit, without losing their togetherness. At death, however, they sink deeply and move independently as if they had never been a unit. I wanted to tell him how completely homogeneous were his statements with my experience, but he didn't let me talk. There is no way to refer to the unknown, he said. One can only witness it. The sorcerer's explanation says that each of us has a center from which the Nahual can be witnessed, willed. Thus, a warrior can venture into the Nahual and let his cluster arrange and rearrange itself in any way possible. I've said to you that the expression of the Nahual is a personal matter. I meant that it is up to the individual warrior himself to direct the arrangement and rearrangements of that cluster. The human form or human feeling is the original one. Perhaps it is the sweetest form of them all to us. There are, however, an endless number of alternative forms which the cluster may adopt. I've said to you that a sorcerer can adopt any form he wants. That is true. A sorcerer who is in possession of the totality of himself